back. This is Chef Jack, and hopefully you've enjoyed your break and you're all rested and ready to go. It's just about how much meat Americans eat. And again, you can see we're the dark blue, tremendous amount of animal products that we eat. And again, a lot of the food is federally subsidized, the grains, the feed. Now other countries are starting to follow suit a little bit as far as their consumption of some of these products. And here we've got how many hog operations there were, starting in the 1960s down to that many, and then but how many animals per operation. It's going down here. Disseminated, dispersed is different. And here, this is an interesting thing. So you've got hogs and pigs. They seem to be in clusters. Either that's the right condition or growing spot for them. There might be some tax increases, but you've got southern Minnesota here, Iowa, and of course you think of the corn and soybeans in Iowa, and then there's another cluster down here in South Carolina. But then what was interesting, Hurricane Florence in 2018 hit South Carolina, and one of the underlying things that happened was a lot of these pig farms are in low-lying areas, and imagine those big manure pits, which you've got all that liquid manure, a couple feet of rain, those lagoons filled up, spilled into local waterways, which contaminated the water. So people were having issues with, drinking water. There was a lot of fish being killed. Thought they kind of fixed it in 2018 or 2019, but again, I know another hurricane came through here and did similar, but not as much damage. And subsequently, a lot of these animals down here died because they were in low areas. They couldn't get them out. So then I know they lost to drowning. But a lot of that doesn't get me, make the news. It's just sure why, but book talked about, how the industry is being just concentrated. More of the market share is owned by the top 4 companies: Tyson, JBS, Cargill, National Meat, Beef, Smithfield for pork, Purdue for chicken. But Tyson, that's a huge, and just think of how much money influence that they have probably in local, state, and federal government. Vertical integration. Farmer used to do most of this. They would figure out the breeding, the feed. Now you've got some of these big companies like Purdue and other companies where they determine the breeds, the feed formulation, and all the grower does. They don't even call him a farmer. It's just a grower. They raise the animals and then it gets shipped off to slaughter, meat processing, and marketing. And I thought this was kind of, the amount of waste generated by humans, the amount of waste generated by the animals that we eat. And that just pretty much speaks for itself. It's just crazy manure that these animals are producing, and how is that being treated and affecting the environment. I think this is a great picture because you've got the feed tanks here, so the feed goes in, feeds the pigs or the chickens. I'm sure this is pigs, and then out comes the pee and the manure slurry and just imagine the smell that's coming off of that and other things that are contained in that slough or sludge. There's a little hog. So they're looking at these lagoons, how it's stored. The waste is not treated to remove pathogens or chemical contaminants, typically applied to fertilize nearby fields. Those fields are designed for X amount of fertilizer. When you've got 50,000 chickens next door, that's almost too much for that land to absorb. They don't transport it because that costs too much. Again, cost. They over apply it, pollute the groundwater, surface water. Antibiotic resistance. We've talked about that, where they used to give antibiotics, are given at low doses to animals to cause them to gain weight faster on less feed, added to diets of healthy. And again, that, they don't want their animals to get sick. They don't want to wait till the animal actually gets sick, so that they just started to give them antibiotics. 80% of the antibiotics sold in the U.S. go to food-producing animals, most of whom are not sick. Overuse, and now we've got resistant pathogens, subtherapeutic antibiotic use, so that the animal actually be sick before that's given to them. And what happens is, you give antibiotics over time, and this has happened over years or decades. One bacteria builds up resistance to it. Boom, these guys all die, but this guy goes on and he starts to multiply. So now all these guys are resistant to the antibiotics that we currently have. And a lot of times now, if you get treated in a hospital, that you might get 2 or 3 different types of antibiotics either at the same time, succession, so that you can kill. And there's some bacteria now that actually hospitals can't treat anymore. If you get that bacteria, chances of survival are not good. Public health, occupational hazards, overcrowding, distressed animals are more likely to shed pathogens. Workers are exposed to airborne hazards. And I know when I went through a local chicken coop, I mean, I walked in the door and it was like, oh my God. It was just like the ammonia just permeated body. It was just like, oh my God, how can you work in here? The feces dries and blows around, dander, fungal spores. Injury rates are high at processing facilities. And this is, the book touched on this a little bit, page 302, 1918, the implications of the novel Influenza, and they attribute it to, when you've got densely packed operations and markets allow for viral reassortment. So when different animals are brought together, opportunity for some of those viruses to commingle, produce something new. And now, 2019, we've got COVID-19. And the first place that they were looking was in China at, what's called a wet market, where they've got all these live animals brought in together. The jury's still out exactly where it is, but when you start densely packing different types of animals or animals together, not quite sure what you're going to end up with. Community impacts. We thought when we went more into the industrialization method that we'd have less bacteria, but now really we've created these super bacteria. Beginning, some of the foodborne illnesses went down, but now they're getting prevalent and more extreme. Half of the U.S. food cause-borne illnesses linked to alga toxins, and that's all brought on from nutrients from your IFAPs. Now something is recalled. You've got 6.5 million pounds because these places are processing, literally thousands of beef a day. They take all the beef, burgers, or whatever out of it, and then if one of them is contaminated, instead of just one or two, you've just contaminated millions of pounds of product. Chemical hazards that's in the food, some of it's in the feed. The animals will concentrate the contaminants. Now you're seeing more of a push that foods or meats don't have growth hormones added to them. Yakima Valley, Washington. Amount of people, amount of cows that live in that county, and then how they started to see how the waste was contaminating water. Community activism. Sometimes, you've got to partner up with your local neighbors and start to file some lawsuits or other, look at best management practices, because sometimes your local city or state governments are not paying attention. Living in Dublin, the guy kind of looked back over, how farms were 25 years ago, more built by neighborhoods, and then it was more of a joint community process. But then over time, it became more industrialized. It used to be more of a symbiotic relationship, and then now you've got health issues from some of these farms, some of these production facilities. A lot of times the offices are not next to the operations. So these Cargill and other, the production facilities are in one state and then offices are another. So they don't, there's not that sense of community. Some things about climate change, aquatic ecosystems. We've talked about that before, leading to dead zones, land use and global security. And then looking at some of the agroecological or AKA pasture-based approaches. The animals are raised outdoors most of the year. And I've talked to some farmers that, the animals, you think it's like 0 degrees out in the farm. Cows want to be in the barn, but actually they don't. They want to, as soon as they're done milking, they're chomping to go back outside. That's where they like to be. Much lower densities, diverse systems, fewer inputs. And that was another thing with some of these grass-based dairy farmers is, their vet bills, and this was on about 150 herd dairy operation, his vet bills was close to $10,000 per year. Once he switched over to grass-based system, his vet bills were between $700 and $800 a year. So again, obviously it's a lot healthier for the animals and it saves the farmer some money. That way the cows go out, eat, poop out in the pastures, and then come back to the barn, milk, and then they go back outside. Whereas when in a or industrial setting, they're bringing in the food, they're milking the cows, and then they're hauling the manure back out to the field. So it's like they're doing most of the work of the animals instead of just let the animals do it. We're looking at a pasture-based system. Cows are out and they like to be in the fields. Traditionally, a managed system is, they'd let them be in one part of the field first, and then they'd move some electrical fencing, and then just keep almost like a checkerboard where they'd keep the animals going around and around in the pasture. Once they eat it to a certain point, then they move the animals. Well, system, here's a link. Polyface Farms is a farm that really a lot of Joe Salatin created it at least 20 years ago, and a lot of farmers have used his information and his research to use their farm as far as pasture-raised cows, chickens. This is a great farm to look at, and they've got a lot of great information in here. Website now. Here we are back at the PowerPoint. So that's Polyface Farm is the name of his farm, Joe Salatin, and a lot of farmers, he's kind of like the guru of pasture-based farming again. Book talked a little bit about policy and dietary change. Different policies are proposed to help mitigate the harms of industrial food animal production and shifting of diets. So we need to strengthen restrictions on antibiotic use and waste applications, animal welfare. So again, if consumers would eat less meat, imported agroecological farming methods, we could start to shift away from industrial practices. And I think you're seeing a lot of, people are trying to eat more healthy, going to shop at local farmers markets, and also chefs. Chefs are trying to support local farms, and it really goes hand in hand. And then looking just at some of the focus, again, seafood production, the book talked about how much food we eat per year. Traditionally, we eat a lot of shrimp, canned tuna, salmon, and then it talked about the wild fisheries, how aquaculture is becoming a new method. And here in this picture, you can see you've got these inlet bays where these big floating circles are pens, and the fish are swimming underneath it. There's a net that keeps them intact. Then you've got a source of a lot of fish manure that just gets concentrated in these little bays. You can see wild fishing is kind of starting to taper off, and then wild capture, and then fish farming aquaculture is growing. And this looks at some of the aquaculture around the country and also around the world. Would be called what's called a hoop house, and you've got a plastic sheet over the top of everything, and on one side you've got vegetables or herbs growing, and then in those blue tanks you've got tilapia or other fish that are being raised, and then the water gets circulated back into the fish. So it's kind of a closed circle. These are two websites that I think are very important to take a look at, and I'll do that at the end of the video. Pew Commission recommended their top 5 recommendations: phase out non-therapeutic antibiotics, require permitting of more operations so that there's a little bit more oversight, ban or phase out liquid waste management, get rid of the gestation crates, battery cages for eggs. And you're seeing some companies or restaurants around the country are starting to, that they're not going to use battery cage is for their chickens or their eggs, and they're trying to phase it out. So the Monterey Bay Aquarium is out, of course, in California, and what they've done is they will recommend fish to eat and fish not to eat. Right now they've got dolphin fish or mahi-mahi, and you can go to learn about other recommendations. Restaurants that will only serve fish that's in the best choice, and then there's good alternatives, and then fish to avoid. Marine Stewardship Council is another one that looks at how seafood is caught, raised, and then they certify it. So those are a couple, I think, interesting or good websites to know about for seafood especially. Hopefully you know a little bit more about sustainable meat and seafood, and happy eating.